Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Introduction to Urban Planning. In today's session, we are going to discuss about slums, and we're going to understand the difference between informal settlements, and then we're going to look at their living conditions, and we are going to look at different interventions at the international level, national level, and few case studies. So accordingly, the coverage would include, to start with, we are going to first explore the link between urbanization and slum. Thereafter, we will look at slum population trend, how it's happening across the globe. Then we'll further try to understand term slum. We will try to look at the difference between informal settlement, difference in slum, and what does it mean to say inadequate housing. Further, we'll look at what kind of data we use for this purpose. We will also look into reasons of slum growth as explained by the key organizations. We will then try to understand the life in slum, how it is really. And thereafter, we will look at slum upgradation and prevention framework given by UN Habitat. Lastly, we will look at various interventions at the international, national level, and we'll also very briefly look at few case studies. Accordingly, the learning outcomes would include that after completion of this session, we should be able to explain the link between urbanization and slum. We should be able to describe and review the slum population trend. Further, we should be able to conceptually differentiate between slum, informal settlements, and inadequate housing. We should be able to identify the source of data which we are going to use for the purpose. We should be able to review the reasons of slum growth as explained by the key organization. We should be able to review the life in slum. Further, we should be able to comprehend the slum upgradation and prevention framework. And lastly, we should be able to list the interventions and critically review them at the international, national level with the help of case studies. To start with, let us revisit our initial lecture on urbanization and sustainable development, and also the lecture where we talked about sustainable development goals. We have discussed on the urbanization trends in our previous lectures. One of the products of urbanization and lapses in planning and governance is slum. As per the UN Habitat report on adequate housing and slum upgradation 2018, we see that they mention that the steady trend towards the urbanization is going to influence virtually every phase of human work in the coming years, including health, economic, social, and environmental. In many parts of the world, especially in the developing countries, high rates of urbanization have shown in the context of stagnating economies and poor planning and governance, creating a new phase of extreme poverty concentrated in these slums or informal settlements in all these major cities. We see that these slums are rapidly increasing. It has never happened before, and this is because of the lack of adequate housing, among many other urban challenges. And we also see that in these slums, poverty and inequality is very much evident. We see that As per the report, that for next 15 years, it is estimated that more than 3 billion people will need adequate housing. The housing and slum challenge, therefore, remains a critical factor in persistence of poverty in the world, depriving millions of urban residents their right to an inadequate standard of living and housing, excluding them from the benefits of sustainable urbanization. The map shows projected number of global slum population by 2025. The number in circle are in million. It is estimated that Asia will have more than 50% of total slum population by 2025. Today, sustainability forms basis of our planning objectives. Looking into Sustainable Development Goals 11 in particular, which commits making cities inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable, the UN explains the challenges cities face can be overcome in ways that allow them to continue to thrive and grow while improving resource use and reducing pollution and poverty. The future we want includes cities of opportunities for all with access to basic services, energy, housing, transportation and more. So this is what UN targets, all the nations together target for this. Further, we see that UN has defined under this particular goal 10 targets and 15 indicators of SDG 11. The very first one, target 11.1, is to ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services and upgradation of slums by 2030. Indicator used to monitor the target is the proportion of urban population living in slums, informal settlements or inadequate housing. As per the UN Habitat Report on Adequate Housing and Slum Upgrading of 2018, in order to design and implement appropriate policies and programs to respond to the housing challenges worldwide, it is important to identify and quantify the proportion of the population that lives in slums within urban areas, those living in informal settlements or those who have inadequate housing. It is explained that the Sustainable Development Goal Indicator 11.1 targets that it integrates two aspects of poor housing condition, the aspect of slums and informal settlements that UN Habitat have been monitoring under the Millennium Development Goals target 7D, mostly in developing countries, and the new aspect on inadequate housing that applies largely to the development countries. Integrating these two aspects makes the indicator universal as it helps capturing housing condition in both developed and developing countries, thus addressing the fundamental principle of leaving no one behind. Further, for the purpose of the SDG, a slum household is defined as a group of individuals living under the same roof lacking one or more of the following conditions, such as access to improved water, access to improved sanitation, sufficient living area and durability of house. Now looking at the slum population and pattern. In the map we can see the share of urban population living in the slum. You can see light yellow shows 10% of urban population living in slum to the dark brown almost indicating 100% of urban population living in slums. You can see where maximum proportion of urban population reside in slum. As per the UN report of General Secretary of 2021, the number of slum dwellers has continued to grow over the years, exceeding 1 billion in 2018. Slum dwellers are most prevalent in the three regions of Eastern and Southern Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa and Central and Southern Asia. In this chart indicating temporal data from 1990 to 2018, you can see nearly 40% of the urban population lives in slum in India. You can also notice that India has considerably brought down its figure from nearly 60% in 1960 to less than 40% in 2018. As per UN report of General Secretary 2021, before the pandemic, cities had rising numbers of slum dwellers worsening air pollution, minimal open public spaces, and limited convenient access to public transportation at the global level. The direct and indirect impacts of COVID-19 pandemic are making it even more unlikely that this goal will be achieved. So probably we're not going to achieve this goal in the given time, with more people forced to live in slums now, where quality of life is deteriorating and vulnerability is increasing. In the left-hand sides of the diagram, you can see India's overall performance with respect to all SDG and in particular SDG 11. On the right-hand side, you can see the performance of different states for SDG 11. Dark green shows the front runner and yellow showing the performing states and red showing the aspirant states. So you may locate your states here, how they perform. Looking at Karnataka, which is one of the front runner in the SDG 11.1 goal, we see that as per the strategies and action plan for Karnataka report on SDG 2030 by Government of Karnataka, it states that Karnataka is one of the most urbanized states in India, with about 40% of its population living in towns and cities with decadal population growth rate of about 25%. The cities in the state have played a role as focal point for working and living, developing the economy and technology, education, research and culture. As per the report, in the last 60 years between 1951 and 2011, Karnataka's urban population has grown by 2.5% per annum, with a share of 6.24% in India's urban population. Of all the urban areas in Karnataka, the most populated one is Bengaluru, which contributes to about 25% of the total urban population, of which about 15% lives in slums. Majority of households reside in semi-pakka structure, with 79% of slums have taps as major source for drinking water, 57% access to toilet facility within own premises and 68% availing drainage facility. In urban Karnataka, about 10% of all slums had no electricity, with 11% of non-notified slums and 10% for non-notified slums. Toilets are the symbol of hygiene and sanitation in human life. Whether they are personal or public, can be easily accessed by the number of toilets and type of toilet. Only a few slums are reported to have private toilets and rest do not have single private toilets. Most of them have community toilets shared by many households. So you can see the condition in our cities. In the table here, we can see how they are targeting to achieve the SDG 11.1 goal. They indicate the baseline value and the targets for 2030. Now let us try to understand the term slum. As per the UN Habitat document of 2012, the term slum refers to a variety of settlements that display a combination of conditions such as poor housing conditions, lack of basic infrastructure, insecurity of tenure, meaning they do not have legal right to live in the place which they are living in, and various kinds of environmental risk are there in the place where they live. There are multiple typologies of slums, and basically an informal model of land development is categorized by the documents for the process of when people occupy, build their houses, when the infrastructure is accessed, and when the planning is done. We see in the figure, in the image, you can see the process of formal urbanization and informal urbanization, how they are reverse process. You may see four ways in which provision of housing and infrastructure is done as per the study of UN, including both formal and informal housing. In the diagram, you can see how housing program works. First, you assure land tenure, then infrastructure, then house construction, and then people come in. Whereas in the site and service scheme, you see that first land is assured, then infrastructure comes in, then people come in, and the house is constructed. In the process, in the settlement upgradation system, you see first people are already there and they build the house to accommodate themselves, and then then they are assured the land, and then infrastructure provision is made for them. Whereas we see in the incremental development scheme, first land tenure is done, people come in and houses are built, and then later infrastructure provision is made. Now moving ahead, we look at the official definition, which is given by United Nations. United Nations uses official definition as given in its document of 2006. A slum is one or a group of individuals living under the same roof in an urban area lacking in one or more of the following 5 amenities. So you need to pay attention here, like if any one of these are lacking or more of these are lacking, they would be considered as slum as per the definition of United Nations. We see the first one being durable housing, which means it needs to have a permanent structure providing protection from extreme climatic condition. Second, we see sufficient living area, so it should not be very congested and it should have enough space for all of them who are staying there. Next, we see access to improved water. We need to see that water is sufficient, it is affordable and can be obtained without any extreme effort. We see the fourth element is access to improved sanitation facility. A private toilet or a public shared toilet is available to them at a reasonable number. Last, we see that a secure tenure. Secure tenure, which means that it gives them right to the land or the house which they live in, and there would not be any forced eviction from that particular place. As per the UN document of 2012, what is considered as slum customarily depends on local and regional perception of housing standards and social conditions. So we will see that the definition would also vary from place to place. So we will see how do we define slum in Indian context. Slum is defined by Census of India and National Sample Survey Office (NSSO). As per the census 2011, we see that we have 3 categories of slum. One is notified slum, where all notified areas in a town or a city notified as slum by the state or the Union Territory Administration or by the local government, housing and slum board or so on under any statute including a slum act. So within that, if it is notified, it would be considered as slum. Other is recognized slum. All areas recognized as slum by the state or the local government or Union Territory Administration, housing and slum boards and so on, which may have been not been normally notified as slum under any statute. So if they are being recognized by them, it would also be considered as a recognized slum. Last we see is the identified slum. So this involves a compact area of at least 300 population or about 60 to 70 households of poorly built congested tenements in unhygienic environment using the inadequate infrastructure and lacking in proper sanitary and drinking water facility in the state and the territory administrative boundary we are looking at. So if the services are not there, then they would be identified as slum. We see that housing for all, we have been seeing housing issues in our country. So all PMAY projects and other things. So Housing for All 2022 program uses the same Census of India classification as well as NSSO classification. Now moving forward, we further see that what is informal settlement. So we are trying to now differentiate between slum and informal settlement. As per the UN Habitat Report on Adequate Housing and Slum Upgrading 2018, informal settlements are residential areas where following conditions apply. First, inhabitants have no security of tenure. So we saw that the tenure is one of the definition as per the UN. So inhabitants have no security of tenure with regards to the land or the dwelling they live, with modalities ranging from squatting to informal rental housing. Second, we see the neighborhoods usually lack or are cut off from basic services and formal city infrastructure. So, for example, if all of us get water supply, probably that neighborhood would not be getting the water supply. So, there's a disconnect of services. Third, we see housing may not comply with the current planning and building regulations, situated in geographically and environmentally hazardous area, and may lack a municipal permit. So, these houses might not follow the building bylaws. Moving on, we'll try to understand what is inadequate housing. A housing unit is considered inadequate if at a minimum it meets the following criteria. So, criteria 1, we see legal security of tenure. So, if they have legal security of tenure which guarantees legal protection against forced evictions, harassment and other threats. Second, we see availability of services, materials, facilities and infrastructure including safe drinking water, adequate sanitation, energy for cooking, heating, lighting, food storage or refuse disposal. Third, affordability, as house is not adequate if its cost threatens or compromises the occupant's enjoyment of human rights. Fourth, we see habitability, as a house is not adequate if it does not guarantee physical safety of the people who live in, or they provide adequate space as well as protection against the cold, damp, heat, rain, wind and any threats to their health and any structural hazards. So, that point is considered here, that the house should be habitable. Next we see is accessibility, as a house is not adequate if the specific needs of a disadvantaged and marginalized groups are not taken into account, such as the poor, people facing discrimination, persons with disabilities, victims of natural disasters. So, it should be accessible to them. They should be able to avail those facilities. Further, we see the consideration is about the location. A house is not adequate if it is cut off from the employment opportunities, healthcare services, schools, child care centers and other social facilities, or if located in dangerous or polluted sites or in immediate proximity to the pollution source. So, then also it would not be considered adequate. Lastly, we see cultural adequacy, as housing is not adequate if it does not respect and take into account the expression of cultural identity and ways of life. So, these were how we judge whether the housing is adequate or not. Moving forward, we may find variety of settlements which might be considered as slums across the globe. So, we see shanty towns, squatter settlements and illegal subdivision characterized by their informal tenure. They also include dilapidated inner city housing, overcrowded tenements, villages within the cities and deteriorating public houses. So, all those variety you can see when you look for the slums. Each of these are originated and grow and develop differently and may vary in size. From the slum could be few huts to thousands of permanent dwellings and may be located in the city, or it can be located in the periphery as well. They are also identified by distinctive terms. So, the terminology is also changed about the slum, what they call in different region, peculiar to the given region and countries. What is considered as slum invariably depends on the local and regional perception of housing standards and social conditions. So, what conditions a particular or what standard a country adopts, depending on that the slum would be defined. So, in the image here we see slums from various places across the world. Moving on to understanding from where do we really get all these information for your benefit as you would be dealing with data for developing understanding. The first is National Statistics Office. Most of the countries keep this. NSOs are responsible for collection and analysis of data in countries. A number of data sources are used to monitor and report on this front, from subnational to national and global level. NSOs collect and validate data from various sources, and you can look at what kind of sources they use. One is major is the census, then you also see demographic and health survey. Then there might be cluster surveys, living standard measurement survey. We have the service level benchmarking surveys, urban inequality surveys. So all these are being mostly done in different countries, and so these are collated, and you can access all these data. Now, trying to understand what are the reasons for the growth of slum. As per the UN Habitat Report on Adequate Housing and Slum Upgrading 2018, a range of interrelated factors usually underlines the growth of both slums and inadequate housing. These may vary from weakness in housing policy. So, there might be weakness in housing policy, like how do we really provide housing to the people. It might be related with poor planning and land management. How do we really manage our land? And then how do we really handle urban migration, and how we handle urban densities, and how do we handle when disasters and conflicts and long-term poverty happens. So all these can be the reasons for lack of affordable housing and eventually leading to development and proliferation of slums. Now moving on, we will try to understand the life in slum. It's very important to understand the life in slum, because once we understand, or we try to understand that, it's easier, or it's at least you reach closer to understanding what solutions might work. The UN Habitat Report, Slum Almanac 2015-16, brings the key facts, data related to successful initiatives together to contribute to understanding the extreme living conditions of slums and the social, economic and human aspects of slum life. The report explains that each day slum residents fight for a better quality of life. So you see that it's a struggle of every day. If humankind succeeds in understanding their challenges, we will be able to come up with the sustainable solutions that will realize their full potential and help build better and more prosperous cities for all. The report indicates denial or deficiency or lack of things in slum. At the household level, we see there are deficiencies which continue to reflect the harsh living conditions of slum dwellers. For example, most slum dwellers still have no security of tenure and live under constant threat of eviction. Many are in the overcrowded dwellings. They continuously considered highly dangerous, the places where they live. Sanitation is often limited, so they have limited access to sanitation, such as the case in Kenya's largest slum, Kibera. In Nairobi, where open sewers lines empty effluent in front of people's houses, and there are only 1,000 public toilets to serve the entire slum population of hundreds of thousands of people. So look at the accessibility issue here. As a result, open defecation areas are still common in these slums. The lives of the people living in slum are also conditioned by other challenges such as health, education, labor, livelihood, gender, dynamics, mobility and connectivity, access to public space, and also security. We further see that slums are often linked to insecurity. Now moving on, we're going to now see that what does the slum upgradation and prevention frameworks is, and what does it really suggest given by UN Habitat. Slum living conditions can be improved based on the evolved and global understanding by UN given in the following framework. We see first it suggests to recognize the slum challenges. It's important that we acknowledge that, and importantly the urban authorities acknowledge it and make necessary arrangements for it. Next, we see that it highlights the need for people-centric approach. For any kind of upgradation, it's important that it is focused on people and not focused on the environment or the building component or the beauty component. Third, we see that it highlights the need for government leadership. National governments have a leading role to play in improving the slums, and they can provide the enabling environment to develop and implement the appropriate policies and plans to make the changes which are required in the slum areas. Further, we see that it emphasizes strengthening of policy response. As per UN Habitat, a dedicated policy framework to regulate sustainable urban development and upgrading and prevention of slum is precondition for effective, sustainable, long-term and large-scale responses. Next, we see it highlights the systemic and citywide at-scale approaches. So the approaches need not be fragmented, but the approach has to be taken at the city level. Next, we see that it highlights the integration of people and systems. So it suggests that all levels of government concerned must develop and coordinate broader integrated policy and planning framework that ensures a more complete understanding of the communities living in slums, their specific priorities and socio-economic dynamics, and then implementing practical changes that ultimately result in the slum upgrading, linking into the broader urban environment and including in the development plans. Then we see the framework guides that appropriate long-term financial investment and inclusive financing options should also be given so that people have choices and they have access to resources. We see that appropriate and sustained level of diversified domestic investments in affordable housing and slum upgrading, public and private, all these sources are critical, as well as creative financial mechanism, encouraging major financial institutions to provide pro-poor housing plans and financing support for all tiers of government. Investment in microfinance housing improvements and incremental auto constructions are also vital. Further, we see UN through the framework suggests to address land issues and provide slum dwellers with security of tenure. Likewise, we see it suggests to have a participatory approach and a community participation, which is very essential for any kind of a development. Next, we see it suggests to combine slum upgradation with employment generation and local economic development. According to them, it is necessary not only to acknowledge the slum economy, but also support it. Beyond expected community contracting during upgrading works, there is need to invest in social capital present in slums, develop cohesion and associativity among slum dwellers, encourage local initiatives, recognize the important role of women in the household economy. Further, we see that the document highlights the need for development of participatory, robust, standardized and computerized data collection process. UN explains that localized qualitative and quantitative data collection and analysis system is important for better understanding by the local urban bodies as well as the other agencies, and interventions can be taken at different level. So managing of the data, analyzing that and also keeping ourselves informed is very important. Lastly, we see it's highlights the need for creating peer learning platforms. So one country is learning from the other, one slum learning from the other, so that peer learning has to be taken care of. So now moving on, we'll quickly look at some of the interventions. One of the intervention is Participatory Slum Upgradation Program, PSUP. It was launched in 2008 as a result of policy dialogue initiative between Africa, Caribbean and Pacific, ACP group of states. 35 countries implemented PSUP and committed to participatory slum upgrading, revising policy, legal and financing framework for housing, land and slum upgrading and prevention. And they also looked into analyzing current living conditions in slums, devising participatory responses and enacting them. So you can see different cases. It's all provided in the suggested reading. So you can see cases from Benin, Botswana, you can also see Mozambique, you can also see Namibia, Nigeria. All these examples are provided to you. We can also see the street-led approach for city-wide slum upgradation by UN Habitat. Further, in order to meet the target 11.1 of SDG, following interventions are monitored. We see that they look at access to improved water. It is believed that household is considered to have access to an improved drinking water source if the household member use a facility that is protected from outside contamination in a particular form of fecal matter contamination. So it's an important indicator. Then we see access to improved sanitation. Next, we see sufficient living areas. So as you have seen, what are the problems? You have also seen how do we define it. So these becomes the parameter. How do we really see our conditions are improving or not? So we judge the sufficient living area. Household dwelling unit provide sufficient living area or not to all its member. If not, more than 3 people share the same habitable room. Then we see the structural quality, durability of the dwellings. While we see this, we look at the permanency of the structure, or what kind of building materials are there. We also see how it is located, where it is located, how it is not located or on or near toxic waste, in the floodplain, not located in the steep slope, not located in a dangerous right of way of rail, highway, airport and power lines. So we also evaluate the location of the house. Houses in slums are mostly made of transitory corrugated iron sheet, shacks, wood, and are located on or near toxic waste, steep slope, or dangerously in the way of transport lines. Next, we evaluate the security of the tenure. Now we will look into the government intervention in order to understand how do we deal with, how do we improve the slum situation in cities. We have had seen before, SDG have been adopted in perspective plan of many states and translated on ground through program convergence. Major programs started by Government of India towards inclusive city development with focus on slums, including provision of basic services and affordable housing to urban poor include. We see slum improvement program in 1970, then we had slum rehabilitation scheme, Valmiki Ambedkar Awas Yojana, we also see JNURM, then we see basic services to urban poor, integrated housing and slum development program. Further, we see Rajiv Awas Yojana, then interested subsidy scheme for housing the urban poor. Now we have Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. In an Indian context, we also have the Slum Area Improvement and Clearance Act of 1956, which focuses on to facilitate inclusive growth and slum-free cities. Then we also focus on slum clearance. We see that there are 2 clear methods of slum clearance: complete removal method and improvement method. We'll look at the second method, improvement method. If the houses are fairly good, certain steps are suggested like improvement of the street system, filling up of the lowland, modification of the drainage arrangement, removal of obstructing structures and so on. There are also options of some slum clearance and rehousing. The graph shows us the share of people living in slum in different states of India. The central government initiated National Slum Improvement Program for slum upgradation. The objective of program was slum upgrading through provision of physical amenities, community infrastructure, healthcare and social amenities. We further see that through National Urban Livelihood Mission as well, there are a lot of components which are taken care of. The problems which you saw in life in slum, you can relate to this, how these kind of initiatives would help people. The scheme of shelter for urban homeless is been initiated. This particular National Urban Housing and Habitat Policy from 2007 aims at promoting sustainable development of habitat in country with a view to ensuring equitable supply of land, shelter and services at affordable price to all sections of the society, and the most vulnerable of these are the urban homeless. So the objectives of the shelter for urban homeless components of NULM scheme are to ensure availability and access of urban homeless population to permanent shelter, cater to the needs of especially vulnerable segment of urban homeless like dependent children, aged, disabled, mentally ill and recovering gravely ill by creating special sections with homeless shelters and providing special service linkages for them. It also provides access to various entitlements. Further, it also formulates structure and framework for engagement for development, management and monitoring of shelter and ensuring basic services to homeless persons. Some of the examples we look, which also got a lot of attention, includes Dharavi slum in Mumbai, Nochikuppam slum in Chennai, Basanti slum in Kolkata, and we see all these examples here. The image shows the congestion and compactness in the slum. In the image, how the spatial growth and pattern of slum from 1800 to 1969, the density has gone high within the limited land. You can see here. So you can see the unsanitary condition in the slum. Following schemes were taken care in this particular slum and which had different results. Another case we see is the slum networking approach to urban development. The idea of slum networking was conceived and developed by Mr. Himanshu Parekh, a consultant engineer based in Ahmedabad. The approach was initially implemented in Indore, where it was highly successful and has since been adopted and developed in many cities. So the idea behind the approach was holistic approach in the entire city. Costs are reduced significantly. You also see substantial human and material resource are mobilized in the process. Community responsibilities and control are increased in such kind of projects. Overall quality of life is improved. So next case we see about is from Indonesia, where you can see the participatory approach was adopted. This is from Kampung, where the informal settlement is there, and you can see that this settlement provide homes for 63% of the population, and this was improved. The intervention was taken here, and you can see in this particular in the picture you can see the housing in Kampung before and after, how the intervention took place. Here you can see this. So how the interventions really bring changes, transform the environmental condition and also the life of the people. So summarizing what we studied today, so we looked at the slums, we looked at the global intention, global problem about slum and how it is linked with the urbanization issue. So we had covered, first we saw the link between urbanization and the slum, how with urbanization even the slums comes in, and then we looked at what is the population trend, how severe is the problem. Then we looked at the terminologies. We tried to understand and differentiate between slum, informal settlement and inadequate housing. Then we looked at the sources of data, and then we looked at reasons why slum growth happens, and then further we looked into how the life is there in slum, what scenario is there. Then we looked at framework given by UN on the slum upgradation, how the things have to be taken care of, and then we looked at the interventions at the international, national, and we just briefly touched upon a few case studies here. These were the references, and suggested case studies are also given to you. Our coverage was limited with the scope to make you aware of the topic. There are enormous readings and movies available to explore. Few are suggested here. This is not an extensive list. You may feel free to suggest more from your experience. Please feel free to ask questions. Let us know about your concerns you have. Do share your opinion, experiences, and suggestions. Looking forward to interacting and co-learning with you while exploring cities and urban planning. Thank you.